if you think about you're going to start a company or you're going to go work for a company, you want to work for one that you believe in the mission. Like I just, because you're going to spend so much of time in your life working for that company or being part of that project. You want it to be something that you care about.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of Impact in the 21st Century, a podcast by Simbi Foundation. If you've listened before, welcome back. If you're new, thanks for listening. We're happy to have you here. My name's Aaron, and I'm the host of Impact in the 21st Century, which is a podcast that celebrates the impactful work of thought leaders around the world, shares the stories of the inspiring individuals who are behind it, and teases out how we can all lead more impactful lives. I'm deeply excited to share this episode with you, featuring Marc Tarpenning. Marc is best known for co-founding Tesla, but he also created the world's first e-reader. He has a knack for finding incredibly difficult problems to tackle and then solving them. And make sure to stick around to the end to hear Marc's advice on integrating positive impact into your career and how we can all lead more impactful lives. But before we dive in, I'd like to tell you about an organization behind this podcast, Simbi Foundation. It's a non-profit organization working in collaboration with the United Nations to enhance access to education in refugee settlements in Uganda. Simbi Foundation builds BrightBoxes, solar-powered classrooms built from shipping containers that provide educational technology, digital learning materials, and sustainable energy through a microgrid to power entire schools and communities. Feel free to learn more at simbifoundation.org. And if you liked the episode, consider donating to this impactful organization. Thanks again for listening. And Marc, it's so good to connect with you. Thanks for taking the time to join me.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So before we jump right in, I'd like to take a moment to share a brief list of your accomplishments and some of your track record, just to provide some context for the conversation. So you co-founded and created the first e-reader with NuvoMedia. You co-founded Tesla and brought the Roadster to fruition. You're a venture partner at Spira Ventures. You're involved in school board and local politics. You're a husband and father to 3. Am I missing anything here?
Yeah, that's enough. Yeah.
Yeah? All right. Now, something that I just really love about you is how you have this tendency to pick problems that you do want to solve, that are technically challenging problems, but also that radically transform entire sectors as we know it. And so you've done this from e-readers to the electrification of the auto industry, and saying that your impact has been significant would be an understatement. I'd love you to just walk me through the thinking and the journey behind NuvoMedia and Tesla, and what excited you about those respective problems and opportunities.
Well, in NuvoMedia, that was an interesting one. So Martin Eberhard and I, who also co-founded Tesla with, this was in 1997. We were looking for technology that could be applied to other things. So we'd done a bunch of consulting. We had been involved in the disk drive industry. We had done display stuff. I mean, we'd done all kinds of stuff in Silicon Valley, and all of these technologies were changing a lot. So with NuvoMedia and electronic reading, that was really the application of display technology. We had seen early samples. I mean, we had sought out early samples of displays, because it was at that time, I know it sounds ridiculous now, but at that time, it was all about whether displays, flat panel displays, could be good enough to actually read on. There weren't really any that were good enough. And we had seen the very latest coming out of Japan. We had traveled all through Japan, seeing these things, and convinced ourselves that this technology was going to be able to be on a display someone could carry with them. And again, it sounds silly now, but at the time, the best you had was something like a Palm Pilot, which showed people liked gadgets, but that display size was very small. The contrast ratio was very poor. You couldn't really, you could read your calendar on it or look up a phone number, but you couldn't really read a novel. No one was going to do that. So when we saw that technology, that the displays were going to get good enough, were just barely going to be good enough by the time we went into production, that's when we launched NuvoMedia.
And in launching NuvoMedia, I mean, were you a prolific reader before then? Were you thinking, I just want to fit more books in, much like the iPod thinking?
Yeah, exactly. So we had both Martin and I read a lot. We looked at, it's funny, at the time we looked at a bunch of different things that were just getting ready for technology, sort of it change. Another one that we identified was video recording onto hard disks, which at the time was actually really quite difficult to do that kind of compression in real time, and then also the actual bandwidth of data going onto a hard disk to keep that fast enough without jittering. And then on top of that, just running out of hard disk space, how much could you really record? And we had been in the disk drive industry, so we'd seen all of that change. And we thought about making, DVRs, which didn't exist at the time. We thought, we could do that. That's going to be just possible right now. But it seemed sort of not right, since neither of us owned a TV. Nor VCRs, and nor did we ever watch TV. So that it just didn't feel quite right. We didn't know the market very well. We didn't know the use case. Whereas reading, we read a lot, and we both travel. Especially, I was traveling a lot in a previous life, and in that travel, it was just a pain. You had all these books and magazines. I always had this giant bag of stuff, and then I was going to places where I couldn't get new material, for months at a time. So I'd bring, books and books and books, bags of books. It was ridiculous. So that was sort of the idea, is that, we could build an e-reader that could hold, a dozen books and more, and you could, it had to be able to have a charge that lasted for one intercontinental flight from the West Coast, because that was our use case. And we figured if we could do that, if we could go from, San Francisco to London or whatever, and you could read the whole time, that would pretty much solve most flight times, especially at that time. That was kind of the longest flight you could take.
It's such an interesting milestone to target. I like that.
Yeah, we also had a desire, since we read a lot and we admired authors. We thought if we got into the sort of book publishing world, we'd get to meet publishers and we'd get to meet authors. So we had a second, it'd be a fun experience.
So did you meet any fun authors or publishers along the way?
Oh yeah, we met essentially all the publishers. I mean, certainly representatives of all the publishing houses, because we had to make deals with the publishers. But then we also got to, when you're in that world, you get invited to, fun parties, largely in New York, which I had little kids at the time. Well, actually, at that time, I didn't have little kids. I was working, it's getting closer to it. But I ended up not being in New York very much. All the publishing houses are in New York, so that's where you have to go. We had an office in New York, and Martin was there a lot. But we met a bunch of West Coast authors, and went to different literary events, kind of thing, and book events. It was great fun.
I want to ask you about e-readers in general. Right now, literacy rates, even in higher income countries like the US, are actually on the decline, which is kind of tragic. And I'm wondering if you think if the e-reader has lived up to the possibilities and opportunity, and if you think that there is more that could be done.
So first off, I mean, it's a tiny percentage of the total book market, I believe. I'm not entirely sure what the numbers are anymore, but and for some people, it's magical. For a certain set of the population, we were surprised. Like one of the things that we did, and when we created the formats for it, we wanted to make sure that you could set the type size, the font size to anything you wanted, and it would reflow. Like we do it all the time with HTML. In fact, we used a derivative of HTML, and it turned out that was incredibly enabling for people. That we would get these fan letters basically from people to say, I haven't been able to read a first run book for 10 years, and suddenly because my vision failed, and now I can buy instantly one of these these top books, and I can just crank the font size up to some huge number, which allows me to read. And I think that e-readers, certainly for a whole segment of the population, and I will say that I'm now to the point where I'm like, hey, I need glasses. I mean, these people obviously had more vision problems, but it's really nice to be able to change the font size at will. And I think that's so when you say has it lived up to its potential, for some people it's magical. It really is incredibly enabling. In general, I mean, for the most part, people that do read on print still, and that's fine too. It's a pretty decent format. It's relatively compact, and it doesn't need batteries, and it doesn't have to be charged and stuff. But there's a lot to be said for having all the books you could possibly want, especially now with bistable displays and extremely long battery lives. But is there more to do? Certainly. I mean, your work at Simbi shows that even just promoting literacy using voice, using the sort of sound and voice with the reading, with the actual text, is a huge enabling technology. And that's something that a book can't do. It's static. It just sits there. Literacy going down everywhere, that's it. That has been a concern since the advent of television, really. I mean, there was commissions in the 50s on what this was going to mean for the society, and yet by and large we've remained somewhat literate. One thing, being in the education field for a while later in my life, was about early reading and how the data on early reading correlating to sort of later success in reading is terrible. That this obsession with learning to read earlier and earlier doesn't translate into any gains later on, and in fact may correlate with less literacy as an adult. So I think that there's definitely a lot of work to do in both how to teach reading for people who have trouble reading, but also, I mean, just in general, and then how to make compelling content that people want. I do think that there is an appeal to being able to see a book or hear about a book and then download it and have it in your hand instantly. People tend to buy more books that way, because if you have to, the next time that I'm on, Amazon, or I go to a bookstore, I'll pick that up. That doesn't happen quite as much as you go, oh, click, and you can read it.
So first of all, on the TV front, you're spot on, right? Since the introduction of TVs in mid 50s, early 60s, we see a continual decline in reading. And then there's a group of people, and I'd love to hear more about your experience on the education front, because I understand that you've been involved in as a decision maker I think for a full district. Is that correct?
It's admittedly a small district, but yeah, I was on the school board for 9 years here in my hometown here.
Right. And I also really loved what you had to say about actually getting involved in local politics and seeing that you could make it an impact in that space, which definitely resonated. Because I think a lot of people turn around and say, it's slow and bureaucratic, I have no interest in trying to dent it.
Yeah, local politics actually works. I don't know how it works at the bigger level, the state and the federal level here in the U.S., but certainly local politics. You could, if you just show up. Showing up is so important in local politics that that in itself is a revolutionary act. Is to simply show up.
But I guess my question for you on this front, though, is so the TV is introduced. And then you have a lot of folks who are part of the only physical book camp. And then you've got a lot of educators who are part of the, they're more accommodating and welcoming for new tech. And when I think about it as more of a macro trend, when I look at what Facebook and TikTok and the highest paid engineers on the planet being paid to essentially distract you with instant gratification and very unique hook model tools, my thinking, and it kind of relates back to the e-reader, but I feel like there's just this tremendous opportunity to be engaging people in lifelong reading, to be getting kids at a very young age to become these prolific readers. And it's not that they have to be an early reader at a super young age, and it's just that you have to build the behavior of reading in order to be a lifelong learner. And I guess my question for you is, if in your perfect world, if you could go back right now and just invent the first e-reader 2.0, would you employ some kind of gamification and various techniques to hook people?
One thing that you can do with e-readers, which I haven't seen really elegantly done yet, but we were experimenting with it even in the 90s, is you can see where people are spending time reading. You can see where in a book, when they're reading a book, you can see where they slow down, where they lose interest and maybe, decide to go get a snack or whatever, and pause the reading if you put it on pause for a while. And I've always wondered, and the authors don't see any of that data, and it's not even clear. I mean, we certainly were collecting it as an experiment just to try to understand. Actually, we were trying to understand the interface better, but really quickly we felt that it could be really valuable to authors and to publishers to understand, what excites the reader in a way. I mean, it's a little creepy, admittedly, but it does show, when somebody just can't put the book down, is a fascinating experience, and we've all had that. And you can capture that and feed that back into the authors and into the publishers and say, although everyone bought this book, nobody read this one really, but it was like a thing that everyone had to buy, but nobody really read it. Whereas this other book, people just couldn't put down. But from the sales numbers, you would see the same. You'd see the same thing. So I'm not sure that I would be so into gamification of it, but I think that there's a lot of instrumentation that could provide authors some interesting feedback, as to what is compelling.
People are reading books. You have this idea that the tech may just be good enough. And you decide, okay, and if we can make sure that the battery lasts for 12 hours or however long that long distance flight is, we're going to be in a good state. We can do something with this. Now, are you applying, what Musk will famously call a first principles approach, or what process are you laying out, and what milestones are you hoping to achieve in order to turn this crazy idea into a massive business?
Well, so the interesting thing about something like ebooks is that there is a content component, which is super, super important. I mean, that's the thing that matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of the regular engineering, and there's all these milestones around that engineering to just get the actual physical consumer electronic device, packaged, the supply chain set up, the figuring out how we're going to distribute it through local stores and Barnes and Nobles, obviously, as it turned out, when they invested. So there's that piece, and that's kind of not a normal thing, but that's stuff that we were familiar with, and Silicon Valley does that kind of stuff, right? On the flip side of that, we had to acquire content. And that turned out to be complicated because it turned out that the book industry is super old. I mean, obviously it's super old, but I mean, like, really old. Like, some of these companies are hundreds of years old, and the same people are running it. Like, it hasn't changed in 150 years. Some of the laws that govern the way books can be bought and sold actually predate the U.S. Constitution, so they're actually grandfathered in from British common law. So you have to do with special lawyers, which are specially expensive to deal with those kinds of contracts because of this like craziness that the publishing world lives in. So we had to really understand that whole process, and things that we thought were important to the publishing industry turned out not to be, which was, that's one of those things where from the outside you think you know the answer, and then as you get deeply involved you realize, oh, they've really thought this out, and this is not, when an industry's been around for that long, they have optimized everything super, super well. So to disrupt that, to really compete well in that, your invention or your technology has to really be kind of orthogonal in some way, or and both maybe complemented in other ways. I mean, it just can't be, are you going to save a few cents over here? Because they're really good at that. They've already done that.
So you said when you're launching a new technology, you want to do it when it is just possible, not too soon and not too late. And so you go ahead and you do that with ebooks, and you sell the organization, and then Tell me about some of the early thinking behind Tesla and just some of those early conversations.
Well, so we ended up selling NuvoMedia, and then both Martin and I did other things for a while, for a few years. And that was at a time when it was a good time to be doing other things, because the dot-com boom had happened and busted, and there was lots of carnage here in Silicon Valley, and it was difficult to start new things for a little while. But by 2003, we were kind of ready to do something new, and we looked at a bunch of things. And Martin, in particular, was getting worried about global warming, which in 2003 was a little less obvious, or a lot less obvious, I should say. So I was really worried about oil consumption from sort of a national security standpoint, an economic standpoint, really. And also, of course, from an environmental perspective, but I wasn't as convinced as Martin was on global warming. Very quickly after that, I was, but not initially. And we knew that batteries were getting better. We had seen that in the consumer electronics world, and we lived and died that with our e-readers. And we'd been following that industry since we started the e-reader, but also we'd been following how it kept getting better and better and better. And this was, again, one of these things where looking at it is like, well, what's changing? What kinds of technologies that are applicable, that are happening in one place, that are being driven by demand someplace, might have, some implication someplace else. The display thing that we ended up with was a special kind of display. The reason we were able to create a really readable display was because there was a huge explosion of Japanese golf computers, and golf computers are out in the sunlight, and they needed to have very, very high contrast sun displays that worked in bright light. And that allowed, and so Japan had been focusing on that problem, and that was perfect for e-readers, it turned out. And likewise with the battery life, this need for longer battery life and more power, when we looked at that application to cars, I mean, we could see that even in 2003, the batteries were just good enough. They weren't great, but we could make a compelling product using that battery technology. And we also knew, looking at that history of batteries, that every year it was getting better and cheaper. So if we started, now in 2003, by the time we had a car out, it would likely, the performance would be better, the pricing would be better. But we didn't know, but it at least worked right now. But it would really probably be better when we launched. And then looking forward, as we create that demand, that was just going to make it even better and cheaper. So we felt that it would feed on itself. So it had a good possibility of success.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I'm just thinking about the equivalent would be someone sitting in Japan thinking, let's get more people golfing so that we can bring the cost of these golf computers down so that we can make an e-reader.
Well, right, exactly, and that's the kind of thing, though, that you want to look for. Is you want to look for these things which where they're focused on one thing, but there's a broader applicability to of the technology that perhaps they're not seeing.
Right, and so if I understand correctly, you were really responsible for heading up the engineering side of the Roadster. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was the head of engineering, but it's a little deceptive. So in the car world, there are lots of engineering heads and lots of different pieces of the puzzle, because you have mechanical engineering, tremendous mechanical engineering. You've got sort of the power electronics, and in our case, you have the thing that makes the car go, but that's just a small piece of the engineering required to build a car, and so we had a variety of different engineering heads. I was in charge of the thing that made the car go, and then over time, as you staff up, your scope becomes narrower and narrower. So eventually, we found some really awesome people who knew a lot about power engineering, which is the thing really the drivetrain engineering. So I was able to give that ended up somewhere else. And I was responsible for the electronics that monitored the batteries and did all the stuff that the car does that isn't making the wheels spin. And that was sort of later. And that's a typical progression. At the beginning, you sort of start with all hats, and then you get narrower and narrower, and deeper and deeper as you go along.
So you start your one day you're programming how pages turn on an e-reader, and the next you're programming how a car is starting and stopping, and the electrical side of that.
Yeah, it sounds funny, but in between there, though, or along that journey, my experience or my specialty is firmware, which is software that's embedded in hardware, and it tends to have to be really reliable. And in fact, what I was doing in the Middle East was all around that. And then when I got into the hard disk business, when I came back from the Middle East, I worked in the hard drive industry, and that's all about unbelievable reliability. 1 in a million is a complete catastrophe. That's because the data is being moved back and forth so often that if only 1 in a million fails, it's going to be failing every couple of minutes. So you have to have these incredible cycles of validation and real high accuracy to make sure that you never make a mistake with the data. And that same sort of discipline is what you need when you push on that accelerator, and you want to make absolutely sure that the computer is synthesizing the correct waveforms to make the motor, to increase the torque on the motor, or to decrease, or whatever the accelerator pedal is telling it. That's got to be rock solid and completely understood. And there it's not just a sort of data integrity issue. Obviously, it's a physical safety issue. So the stakes are even higher. So it isn't as unrelated as it seems. You think about it and you're like, oh, well, it's e-readers, and it's, but it's the underlying software that makes these things go is actually kind of related.
Right. I think it just blows my mind how significantly not single-handedly, but how significantly you've disrupted two industries that seemed impenetrable in one lifetime. And it is quite amazing.
Well, but remember, you say, but it takes, all of these things. There are lots of people trying these things, and most of them, for whatever reason, don't succeed. And the ones that do succeed, it's not just a person or a couple of people. Like Tesla has 50 or 80 or 100,000 employees now, doing its thing. And even when we left, when Martin left, and then I left a little bit later after the Roadster was shipping, we were a company of hundreds of people, which, by comparison now, the company was quite small, but and we had employed many hundreds others, along the way to make that vision happen. So it isn't just, a few people do this. I mean, it's really a team sport, and it's especially the more complicated the technology, the teams get very, very large. There's a great picture of one segment of the team of the Roadster when we were delivering the first Roadsters, and it fills the frame because it took a lot of people, and that's only the people that happened to be there that day that were right there and could get their face into the picture.
Right. So walk me through some of the early history of Tesla, if you don't mind. So you and Martin co-found the company, and I'd love to understand a bit of a history, but also what I understood was that you raised a $7.5 million Series A, and you knew that you needed to ship a certain amount of Roadsters in order to make it to the next kind of production milestone. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. So we started the company in 2003. We spend in July of 2003, and then we spend tomorrow will be, so July 1st is the day. So we're recording this on June 30th. In 2003. And we spent from that date until the end of the year, basically the holidays, the Christmas holidays, figuring out if it was possible, and really fleshing out how we were going to do it. What kinds of technology was going to work. We had run some tests. We wrote business plans. We did spreadsheets. We did all the stuff that you expect, and we created the deck, the investment deck, and then started looking for money in January 2004. And we'd put in money, to fund it along the way, but really we needed, $7 or $8 million to start. And now that would be like a seed round. But at the time it was Series A. The word seed didn't exist, I don't think then. It was Series A was where you started. And so we went looking. We found a couple of VCs that said yes, but they don't lead. So we were looking for lead investors. It's for those familiar with it, you need, or not familiar, you need the lead investors to set the terms. And we pitched Elon, who was in his first year at SpaceX. So he had started SpaceX, and SpaceX, literally was building rocket ships, but hadn't had any success. I mean, they hadn't even tested the first motor yet. Like, this was really, really early. So we went and visited him down in, I think it was Hawthorne. It's some Los Angeles, wherever SpaceX was at the beginning, and pitched him, and he peppered us with questions over the course of a weekend, and then said, I'm in. I love the vision. He was totally supportive of the vision, and he led the round, and then that catalyzed everything, and then all the other money came in. But that wasn't what we needed to get into production for the Roadster. That was, we had a multi-tiered plan of milestones and each time we complete a milestone, we'd raise more money. So that first one was simply to prove out that this kind of battery could be put into a large battery pack safely and in a way that would make sense for an automotive application. So that was all that first money was supposed to do. And then we did that. We created what's called a mule in the industry, which is a car that's a little bit of one car and a little bit of both another car, but it doesn't reproduce. That's why it's called a mule. It's a rolling test bed. So we created a mule and got to drive that with our battery pack using power electronics and motors from a company called AC Propulsion, which was kind of the top of the line hobbyist conversion, electric car company at the time. So we got that working and demonstrated that the key thing, the thing that was the hardest, the thing that was the enabling technology, we could make work. We could prove that worked. And you want to get rid of those big scary things first. You don't do the easy stuff first and then hope that you get the big scary thing figured out, before it's too late. You want to do the big scary thing to begin with. So that was the big scary thing, and we did that first. And then so that allowed us to raise more money, which then our next milestone was around showing that we could have a full drivetrain that met the performance specs that we believed we would meet. And that was complicated and had all its own, issues. At the same time, we were engaged with Lotus that was going to screw the car together and help us actually build the car part, if you will. And we would supply the drivetrain, we'd supply all the electronics, and they would screw the car together. And they had a contract manufacturing wing that did that for other car companies. So we fit into their business model, which was really important.
And so you did that. I think it was the first couple thousand units that you sold were Elises, right?
Well, they're not Lotus Elises. No, they were built on the same factory line as the Lotus Elise, and because we use some of the same parts, and because their factory machinery only could grab certain sized cars, our car ends up looking a lot like a Lotus Elise. It's longer. It has a different frame. It has a redesigned aluminum frame, which was, is part of Lotus's technology. All their cars and all the things they made for people have this sort of interesting monocoque aluminum frame. So we had our unique one of that, and it is reminiscent of Elise, but it has millions of dollars of changes and tooling and everything else to make that car. But it had to fit in the machinery. The things that grabbed hold of the thing had to fit. So we were constrained. We would have loved to have made the car a little bit wider, but you can't do that and be in that factory. So
understood. So you've really, not you single-handedly, but you with big, beautiful, well-aligned teams have disrupted two industries. And I do wonder, have you got a third in you?
No, I'm not going to be starting another company if
Yeah.
that's what you mean. So, what I do now, what I focus on now is investing in companies and investing in founders that are going to do that to other industries, which I think are important. And my focus is on at Sparrow Ventures. My focus is on sustainability. So, although Sparrow invests in many different things, my particular portfolio is all around companies that are, you know, helping agriculture in some way, or helping water, or CO2 emissions, or pollution in general, or people's health through environmental health. uh, that's what interests me. So
Makes sense. With Spiro Ventures, what actually kind of endeared you to their firm as opposed to other VCs?
oh, they have a couple of things that I think were great. First off, they believe in mission. They want companies that they want founders and founding teams that have a mission. It's not just the next shiny object. But more importantly, they really don't invest in stuff that doesn't have some sort of plausible path to make life better in the future. And I know it sounds like, oh, of course, all companies try to. That's really not the case. There are a lot of companies that are out there that they make a shiny thing and people buy it and stuff, but Sparrow is really focused on the health of the people and of planet, and of things that provide joy, and that's the kind of companies that I want to be associated with. And I got to be with them for a while, just watching them in their deal meetings, and turning down interesting companies, but that didn't fit into their sort of filter of is this a company that makes life better? Now, it's not to say those companies weren't great, but they just they didn't make life better, so they didn't want to invest in those.
Do you have any tips or tricks or calendar hacks or anything that can help lead more impactful, productive lives?
Not really. I mean, I wish I knew some. That would be great. The one thing I will say is that it's possible to have a positive impact on whatever you do, and it's whether that's your kid's school, by showing up, like as I said at the beginning, just showing up is a radical act, and caring is a radical act, and it really does make a difference. It certainly makes a difference in schools and in local politics, and I think it also makes a difference in companies. That if you think about, you're going to start a company, or you're going to go work for a company, you want to work for one that you believe in the mission. Like I just because you're going to spend so much of time in your life working for that company, or being part of that project. You want it to be something that you care about, and not just, oh, it's a job. I work at some company that I don't even know what the product is. I just don't feel that that's I know many people who do that and they're fine, but I just, for me, it doesn't work. It's just, and there's so many things out there. We're reinventing so much of the economy all the time, that to not go after something that's compelling that way, and that makes a difference, just seems kind of a waste. I don't know.
Very well put. But I have heard you speak about a commonplace book. I was thinking that may be one of these.
Oh yeah, so that's something I do. So there is this a commonplace book is something from ages ago, from the Renaissance probably, where people would, anything that they found interesting, and this is at a time when natural philosophy was the beginning of science and stuff. People would write these things in, and it might be poetry that they found interesting, or that they created that they liked. It might be some observation of a beetle, that they run across, or some custom that they thought was interesting that they encountered in the countryside or a different city. And they would write these things in their commonplace book. And the interesting thing is, they deliberately did not organize it. They deliberately made sure that, and they had mechanisms to make sure that you weren't organizing it, but could still kind of find things. So there's a bunch of different, I think Ben Franklin had published his particular way of getting into his commonplace book. But the idea was that all of these different experiences and these different ideas would sort of would sit there in your book, and then when you went and looked at it, you wouldn't, order them by anything. You would just open it up and you'd sort of see if you could find connections between those. And I've always found that it's actually from a book called, I think, Where Good Ideas Come From. And they just mentioned this technique. And as it turns out, modern digital things are really easy for that, because both you can look at it in random order, you can look at it, obviously you can do a search on a keyword or whatever. So to me, those are like the modern commonplace books. So I save all kinds of random thoughts, random notes, things, weird articles that I find that are interesting, and hope that by looking at it at some point I have some insight. Whether or not that actually happens, I don't know, but I love the idea of it.
And do you keep a digital and an analog one?
I only keep a digital one.
Okay.
Yeah. My daughter, has a beautiful sort of journal, and it's gorgeous and it's beautifully highlighted, and her notes from classes look, like beautiful. It just isn't. I'm the same. I type stuff in. I'm a great typist. So.
And what app or what program do you use for this?
I should just use Evernote.
Okay. I got to tell you, it is such a pleasure to speak with you, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, this has been great fun, and thank you for including me in your podcasts.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found listening as meaningful as we did. Personally, I was inspired by Marc's humility and the Tesla founding story. Hope you also found some value in his approach to leading a more impactful life. If you enjoyed listening, please consider subscribing on whichever platform you're listening from, and leave us a review or a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or feel free to recommend a guest for a future episode. And thank you to RBC for sponsoring this episode. Impact in the 21st Century is a podcast by Simbi Foundation, which is a non-profit organization working in collaboration with the United Nations to enhance access to education in refugee settlements in Uganda. Simbi Foundation builds BrightBoxes, solar-powered classrooms built from shipping containers that provide educational technology, digital learning materials, and sustainable energy through a microgrid to power entire schools and communities. Feel free to check out more of our work in Uganda and India at www.simbifoundation.org. Thanks again for listening, and see you in the next one.